Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to be continuing in Ezekiel. Today we'll be in chapter 15. But today I think it'll be instructive for us to take a quick look at Isaiah 5 verses 1 through 7. And we should read chapter 15 in view of this passage out of Isaiah. The Isaiah passage is a famous parable. It's called the Song of the Vineyard. So we're going to cover that first very quickly, and then we'll get into chapter 15. Okay, let's go. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 7 out of Isaiah comes in two parts. One is the parable, and the second part is the interpretation of the parable. And as you read through this with me, I think that you're going to see that you can start to feel God's pain some 150 years before the book of Ezekiel was written. Okay, so let's look at chapter 5 of Isaiah, verses 1 through 7. Let me read verses 1 and 2. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. All right. Verse 1 starts out, says, I will sing for the one I love. This is a little bit unusual because it's Isaiah is the one that says, I will sing. Isaiah is singing for the one he loves, and the one he loves is God. And it's a song about God's vineyard, his vineyard, the vineyard of the one that he loves. Now, what I find interesting, I went back and looked at the King James in that verse 1 where it talks about the one I love, and the translation there is it's a level deeper than the one I love. Some translations say the beloved, but the King James says well beloved. So if beloved means deeply loved, then well beloved would have to be a level deeper than that. Well beloved, deeper than beloved. So it's well beloved, or well loved. Okay, so that has to be God. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. Now we're going to have to figure out who the vineyard is, although when we get over to chapter 7, he tells us outright who it is. You'll readily see that it's Israel. And he says, my loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of all the stones and planted it with the choicest vines. So what he's done here in the parable, he's found a place to plant a vineyard. That vineyard in the parable, the meaning is Israel, and he's prepared it, the land, in the choicest land, and cleared it of any impediments he might have to growing a vineyard. So he's prepared everything well. He even put a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. So he's prepared it, and he's built a protection for it. All right, so let's look at, let's see. Let's look at verse 3. Now you dwellers, the end of, I didn't read all of verse 2. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but he yielded only bad fruit. So he went to all this trouble to pick out the land, to clear it of any kind of impediments to growing a great vineyard. And what does he do? He gets a crop and he looks at it, and there's no good grapes in there. All he found was bad fruit. All right, so let's look at verse 3. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem, people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Judge between God and my vineyard. Judge between God and Israel. What more could I have done? Now this starts to sound a little bit like frustration on God's part, but we know that God he never gets frustrated. His plan, he always knows what's going to happen. He never is surprised about anything. And he says, now, what more could I have done? What more could have been done for my vineyard than what I have done? What more can I do? I'm not frustrated. I'm disappointed. I've got pain in my heart for this. What more could I have done when I looked for good grapes and all I found was bad? And you get over to verse 5, and it says, now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I'm going to take away the hedge. A hedge was a hedge of protection, a hedge built around the garden, a fence built around the garden. I will take away my hedge, and it will be destroyed. Because he only found bad grapes, there's no reason to have it. I will break down the wall, and it will be trampled. So you break down the walls and the hedges for protection, and whatever's running loose in the countryside can run right through there and trample down the vineyard. And then in verse 6, he says, I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I'm not going to do anything to cultivate it. I've done everything I can possibly do. They're on their own. They want to be on their own. They chose to reject me, so they get what they asked for. I will command the clouds not even to rain on it. The vineyard in verse 7, now here it is. If you want to know if I'm right about the vineyard being Israel, look at verse 7. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. And the people of Judah are the vines. He delighted in it. And he looked, okay, and he's got the vineyard is Israel. We think of that corporate Israel, the country, the nation, and the vines are the individual people in that nation. And he says, and I looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. So he said over there, I looked for good grapes, I only found bad. Here he says in the interpretation of this parable, he said we've got the nation of Israel and the people in Judah are the vines, but he says, I looked for justice, but I saw bloodshed, and for righteousness, but heard only cries of distress. All right, so that's the end of it. He prepares this place for the ones he loved, his vineyard, which is Israel. He cultivates them, gives them every advantage. And what happens? He finds that they've rejected him, and he's got no good grapes, only bad. No good fruit, only bad fruit. Okay, so one of the interesting things about this takes me back to the book of Hosea, because we have a situation here. Anybody that sat through my teaching on Hosea and now through my teaching on Ezekiel knows how disappointed I was to do these studies on my own when I found out really what a bad shape Israel, God's people, God's chosen people were in. They had chosen to reject him and to choose idols over him. And some interesting things happened when we read through Hosea. If you look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, we studied Hosea, which is prophecy about the northern kingdom, and now we're studying Ezekiel, which is prophecy about the southern kingdom, with an understanding that idolatry was the underlying problem that God had with the people. But it goes deeper than that. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about if we talk about this for a minute. In Isaiah, God looked for fruit which springs from the love of God and right relationship with God, but they had only gods of their own design, so but they had only gods of their own design. So injustice, bloodshed, and unrighteousness sprung forth. That's what he found there in verse 7. He says, I looked for good, all I found was injustice and bloodshed and unrighteousness. So now let's go over and look at Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. This is kind of an eye-opener for me because of the shape that the United States is in. Look at Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Verse 1 is what God wanted them to have. Let me read those 3 verses. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no unfaithfulness, no love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. What he wants them to have was found in verse 1. He said there's no faithfulness, no love, and no acknowledgement of God. That's what he wanted them to have. But he says in verse 2, this is all that you have. And I listed them off for you. Only cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. And that's actually the reason that they're going to be judged. If you look at verse 3 there, it says, because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in will waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the fish of the sea will be swept away. So because of what they have, the way they live their lives, with the murder and all those things, adultery, and all those things that were listed there, they're going to be judged. Since they didn't have a right relationship with God, love and a right relationship with God, they basically had what comes with the breaking of all of the 10 commandments. Because they didn't have those 3 things, faithfulness, love, and acknowledgement of God, because they didn't have those things, what follows was all those things that were listed there, murder and adultery and those sorts, which is basically the breaking of all the 10 commandments. Now what I want to tell you, what I want to talk to you about just for a second is murder. You say, well, I'm no murderer. And most of the people are saying, well, I'm no murderer. But what we're talking about when we're listing all those things, there's probably nobody there necessarily that was guilty of all of them, but it was their culture. Let's take murder, for example. In Dallas, Texas, I heard on the news last night, not last night, but within the last week or so, that in the United States there have been 68 mass murders already. And you can listen to the news every night and hear somewhere where some guy got in an argument with somebody in a bar or even at a party somewhere and got mad and went out to his car and got his gun and either went in the house and started shooting people up, or wait until that guy that he got in a fight with came out of the house and ends up shooting him out on the parking lot. That's a culture of murder. The other people at the party were not murderers, but this guy was. But it's one of the things that was a common occurrence in their time. It's a common occurrence in our time. So we can say, but we can say at least I have God and I'm not as bad as they are. What the secular world of the USA now has in its culture of people is a culture of people who do not need God because they are good people by their own definition. The reality is God is good, only God is good by the words of Jesus Christ himself. He said that in Mark 10:18. So the secular world, full of good people, worship gods of their own design, and the culture defined by Hosea 4:2 comes home to roost, on which the United States, I'm sure someday, will be judged. It's our culture because a large number of people in the United States have come to a point where they say that very thing. I'm a good person and I don't need God. And as a result of not needing God or worshiping a God of your own design, those things that were listed there in Hosea 4 verse 2 become part of the culture. If you had the items of the first verse 1, faith, love, and knowledge of God, you got a better chance of the things in verse 2 not becoming part of your culture. Okay, so that's where they were back in Hosea and in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom both. So that brings us to chapter 15 of today's lesson. It also is a parable, and it comes in two parts. You have the parable and the interpretation. So let's look at it. Ezekiel 15. It's a short chapter. Let's look at that. Let me read verses 1 through 5. It's a similar, what I told you at the beginning of this study. I want us to read this chapter, verse 15, in view of Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7. So let's do that. Verses 1 through 5 here in chapter 15. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, how is the wood of a vine, that would be a grapevine, how is the wood of a grapevine different from that of a branch from any other tree in the forest? Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang from things on the wall? And after it is thrown into the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? In verse 5, if it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be made into something useful when the fire has burned it and it is charred? All right. Israel is the vine. If you go back to the verse Isaiah 5, we talked about corporate Israel being the vineyard and the individual people being the vines. Well, this is the same sort of thing here. We're going to look at Israel as the vine, and this parable is for Israel who had been protected by God. Up to the time of Ezekiel, they had enjoyed this protection by being God's people. And the purpose of the grapevine is to produce grapes. It's to bear fruit. Why else would you have a grapevine? The wood of the vine, in other words, Israel, had abandoned its purpose that gave it value, the bearing of fruit. To use the wood of the grapevine for anything other than being a grapevine is a waste of time. It has no value. The purpose of it is to be a grapevine. It's not a kind of wood that you can make tabletops out of, or door frames, or tent pegs, or anything else. It's made for grapevine. If you take it out of its element, then it becomes useless. Ezekiel ignored the fruit-bearing properties that were lacking in Israel and focused on the quality of the wood. So forgetting about the fruit for a minute, let's just look at the wood, for which the vine was notoriously useless. So let's look at verse 3. Verse 3 says this. Let me read it again. Verse 3. Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? Basically, verse 3 says the wood of the vine is not even good for making wall pegs. It is useless. The wood of any tree is better than a grapevine for using even for that. In verse 4, let's look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, and after it's thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? Okay, if it was useless for anything before it was burned, is burning it going to make it useful? Well, the answer is no. It's even less useful. It's even more useless after it's burned. Okay, then if we get to verse 5, let me read verse 5. If it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be made into something useful when the fire has burned it and it is charred? In verse 5, the whole branch which produced the fruit are pruned. In other words, they are worthless before pruning. They will be more worthless after the whole branch is burned and charred. Okay, so this is, again, gets back to what I already said. We're talking about wood of a grapevine. It's not good for anything. You cut it out, it's good for being a grapevine, and that's about it. If you cut it, you prune it, and try to make anything out of it, it's not useful for anything, not even for making a peg to drive in the ground as a tent peg or to drive in the wall to hang your picture on. It's worthless for anything other than what it was made. And any tree would be better than that. Okay, so now what happens if you've got that useless piece of wood and you burn it? It's going to, because you're trying to get rid of it, if you burn it and you don't burn it all the way up, it's even less useful than it was before. Now it's totally useless and completely useless. Okay, and so this is an obvious reference to the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. There was a partial destruction in 605 BC, and the final destruction comes to Jerusalem in 586 BC. Okay, so the interpretation of this parable comes in verses 6 through 8. So let me read those verses. Then I passed by and saw you. I'm sorry, that was 16. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: as I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so I will treat the people living in Jerusalem. I will set my face against them. Although they have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord. I will make the land desolate because they have been unfaithful, declares the sovereign Lord. All right, that's pretty clear what's going on there. This is the interpretation of the implications of the parable. There will be the fire of judgment against the people of Jerusalem for their unfaithfulness, stated in verse 8. Since they bear no fruit like the vine, they will be put under judgment. The land will be rendered desolate, and they will basically are going to be going into captivity. And that's the message that they've wanted to reject from the false prophets, because the false prophets had a much more palatable message to preach about, which they accepted and rejected the prophecies of Ezekiel. So they will be going into judgment, and that's what this is about. All right, I want to thank you for studying with me today.